treated as animals and forced into sexual acts. The secrets of slave plantations in the United States. Greetings. Today, we're going to talk about slave plantations in the USA and what conditions were given to black slaves. Is it true that Africans worked on the plantations practically all day long? What DNA analysis showed when one of the famous presidents, being married, got intimate with a slave girl? And who were the puppies that were bred on American slave plantations? Be sure to watch the video to the very end to learn all the details of the lives of African slaves in the United States. Quickly found a use for them. If you remember, slavery in the US was abolished after the events of the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. However, black people were first brought to America back in the early 17th century. Americans soon realized the value of Africans deprived of rights and freedoms. At that time, cotton, tobacco, rice, corn, sugarcane, etc. were widely grown in North and South America. The vast plantations required physical labor to keep the cultivated plants fertile. And then the Americans made the final decision. Black slaves were to do hard physical labor for years to come. It was Africans who represented the very free labor force that the US needed. Except that slaves had a hard time adapting to the new conditions in life. Slave owners did not value human labor at all and therefore treated black people cruelly and cold-bloodedly. How? Well, let's look at it in order. One day in the life of a slave in the United States. To have an accurate picture of the life of an African brought to America, it is necessary to immerse ourselves in that atmosphere. To do so, let's travel back to that period, and we will finally find out what really happened and what surprises awaited the slave. So, every slave's daily occupation was to work on plantations and farms. In some cases, black people worked in the house of their master, and that's not a 5-day, 8-hour workday. It was much worse. The average working day lasted 19 hours without a day off. Only a few people had 1 day of rest every month or week, usually on Sunday. In other cases, slaves worked from sunrise to sunset. Work on farmland was divided among all members of slave families. Black people experienced psychological torment in addition to physical pain. Not everyone could accept their fate when their loved ones were taken from them. Slaves were treated like livestock. They could beat them even for the slightest misdemeanor or disobedience to their masters. They beat the wrongdoer with extreme cruelty. For escape, even more so. As for running away, in the United States, there was a law according to which it was allowed to search for slaves in all states of America. Often, slave hunters who wanted to make money were involved in the search. Torture occurred regularly throughout the United States. Slaves were beaten to death, had parts of their bodies amputated, castrated, and even publicly burned at the stake. In this way, the Americans clearly demonstrated to other Africans what fate awaited them for disobedience and attempted escape. And what is the worst, they did not spare men, women, and children. Pregnant women were also physically abused. Are you wondering how slaves were fed? Due to the fact that on the plantations grew mainly cultivated varieties of plants, they just formed the basis for the future diet. Mostly corn, beans, potatoes. As a meat product was supposed to be pork. Africans who showed themselves on the best side could count on something more. They were entitled to a glass of wine. In addition to working on the main territory of the slave owner, they could also develop their own small plot of land, where in fact they grew cultivated plants. But black people could not boast of everyday clothes, and all because they were entitled to 3 pairs of both shoes and underwear. And the shoes were of poor quality. Hard material and frequent mismatch with the size of the foot did not give rest to the poor people. Coercion to sexual acts. To the question whether slaves were forced to sexual acts, we answer with full confidence. Yes. This is another type of abuse. This practice became widespread for a reason. First, as you already know, black people were not considered full-fledged human beings. So slave owners could afford to do whatever they wanted, up to and including the violence that went on year after year. Secondly, at that time, it was necessary to keep the population of the African people at an adequate level. Children born into a slave family were soon doing physical labor as well. Women and men were forced to have sex under compulsion. And to get the expected results, male representatives satisfied several slave women at once. Interesting fact, one of the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, personally did not neglect the services of slavery. Although America's third president initially opposed slavery, he never freed the slaves. A slave named Sally Heming resided in the family of the statesman. Between Jefferson and the girl began warm feelings, which led to intimacy. Sally soon gave birth to 6 children. DNA analysis conducted several decades later revealed that their father is Thomas Jefferson. This is one of the most famous sex scandals of the time for one simple reason. At the time of intimacy with the slave girl, the president was already officially married. Reproduction is the way to success. The year 1808 was an important date in the history of slavery in the United States. From that moment, the authorities imposed a ban on the importation of Africans into America. But enterprising slave owners were not confused. They began to select fertile enslaved women from the total number of Africans to give birth to as many children as possible. The result exceeded all American expectations, as the slave population became self-sufficient. To reproduce the slave population, the very slave plantations, farms we mentioned at the beginning, were used. In them, slaves could satisfy their physiological needs in order to use the labor of the future generation. It is not without reason that at the beginning of the 19th century, the domestic market for slavery began to expand, and thus the demand grew. The largest slave farms were located in Richmond, Virginia, and eastern Maryland. In addition to all this, plantations for the breeding of black people performed another function: breeding. Slave owners tried to increase the value of Africans and their offspring in every possible way. By the way, the children born were called puppies. This indifferent attitude caused discontent among the slaves, which made the process of enslavement more visible. Soon after Abraham Lincoln came to power, slavery ceased to exist. The 16th President of the United States opposed this phenomenon from the very beginning of his political career. In addition, the North of America was developing rapidly in terms of industry. But the South of the country, supporting the slave system, was lagging behind economically. Because of these contradictions, the Civil War began. Conclusion. Thus, slavery in the United States left an indelible trace in the whole world history. Slave owners with special cruelty treated people from whom rights and freedoms were taken away. Slave plantations for reproduction of black people became widespread on the territory of the American continent. But this continued until 1865, after which Africans were freed once and for all.